The cruel irony is that the greatest blow often comes not at the hands of our attacker, but of a system designed to protect victims of crime. Are you listening to that, Minister, what people are actually saying? They go to the trouble of actually reporting the most personal injury to themselves, and they find the second trauma is the court system, the legal system. I'm asking you to take that on board and to listen to what they're saying. So one of the most positive things that we've seen in the last year is that women and men, we also have male survivors of gender-based violence here today, who actually go through this process, are then deciding to waive their anonymity. They come out onto the court steps, they describe what they've been through, and they do it for a reason. They don't want anyone else to go through the same thing again. That's why they should not have to do this. Such is the horror of the misogynistic court process, the injustice of our justice system, that they're breaking the silence. In the words of the inspirational Giselle Pellico, shame must change sides. They want today to be a turning point. They thought they had turning points before. Promises were not kept. Change didn't come. But this has to be a turning point now, today. So the motion, as I said, outlines the scale of the problem. And we have to name the issue clearly here as well, because some, for example, in the far right, are trying to use this issue to stir up racism and division. This is essentially a problem of male violence. It's rooted in the patriarchal family structures created by capitalism. It's rooted in male supremacy, entitlement, and it's rooted in gender inequality. The idea that men have the right to control women, to control their bodies, and in fact, macho culture isn't decreasing, it's actually increasing. On the internet, we know the statistics, it's promoted to young boys within minutes of setting up a TikTok, and not a thing is being done about it. It's suiting the system now, as we see writ large in the US, to promote misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and of course racism. And it's perfectly seen in the US, where you have violent sexual predators in leading positions now in the administration. The ultimate male entitlement is exemplified in femicide, the idea of that you own and control that woman's life, and that she must be killed. And I think that we have to say that we have to challenge those ideas. We have to challenge that culture of misogyny, which lends itself to violence against women and girls. Gender-based violence has a brutal reality and impact on the lives of people. The large majority never report, and as I said, those who do so to stop other people. And every time that somebody hears, every time someone isn't believed, every time someone's victim blamed, and every time a man is praised as being a pillar of society, when behind closed doors they're actually something completely different. That's extremely damaging, and it's also increasing the culture of gender-based violence. So the failure of successive governments to do anything about this issue, about this brutally misogynistic legal system, anytime change is asked for, there's always a compelling reason put forward by the government as to why it can't be done. The Constitution, we're told. So rape myths like clothing, contraception, fake tan, relationships that the victim may have been in, the fact that they took drugs or drink, all of these things. Why are these being allowed on a daily basis, Minister, in our courts? And what are you going to do about it? This deeply misogynistic thinking is about what women wear, etc., is extremely, extremely damaging. And now a couple of issues have emerged as being particularly prominent for many of the survivors of this court process. I want to start with the first one, which is character references. We have to begin by saying that gender-based violence is quite a unique crime. The perpetrators are master manipulators. Nobody knows what they're like in private, in their relationships or in their encounters with people. Now, 2 weeks ago, 35 references were trotted up for a Gardaí who had actually sexually assaulted a woman twice, falsely imprisoned her, on the job in the Garda station. And among those references were from, we think, Gardaí. I've spoken to that woman. She does not know who wrote those references, but it was extremely damaging and traumatising for her. I read yesterday a report of 7 testimonies. I think they're changing the name of them now because I know how damaging character references is, for a child rapist, somebody 50 years senior to the victim. And, you know, this is going on every day in the courts. What is the purpose of these references, Minister? They're utterly irrelevant. They're written by unqualified people. There's no recognition of the dynamic of gender violence, of the fact that the perpetrator cultivates a persona. And there's a brilliant description by one survivor that these references are testifying to nothing more than the mastery of manipulation skills a sex offender has, because the whole MO of a sex offender is that. So there was a recent change made whereby people can be cross-examined if they write a reference. I don't think that that's enough, Minister. That is absolutely worthless, because what benefit is it if 35 people are traipsing up to the witness stand to testify? It actually could be even more damaging. We need to say that they've no place in court. They are not relevant to a fair trial. The other issue is counselling records. This has emerged as a really traumatising issue for so many people. This was sent around to TDs yesterday, but I want to read a snippet of the words from Hazel, where she said, "I've worked so hard to rebuild myself, get to know the new me, since the morning I was raped." And she talks about the benefit of counselling with the Rape Crisis team. And she said, "I never knew my thoughts, my fears, my shame, my turmoil, shared during the safety of a counselling session, could be shared with the person who actually did this to me." Minister, why is this going on? Like, seriously, and not alone has it's increased since 2018, since the change was brought in. Since 19A was brought in, 19A is a joke. It has not been used. The onus has been put on the actual victim to just give their notes, and if they don't give their notes, they're told their trial will be delayed, they're told it will just bring more hassle for themselves, and they therefore just give them. So I want to ask you what evidence is procured from a therapy session that's vital to somebody's right to a fair trial. I would die on a ditch for the right to a fair trial. But the idea that notes that were made by a therapist, by the way, the notes are not even from the person. They're a therapist's note of what the actual person said. Therefore, the third party don't even know why they're admissible. What about the right to privacy? What about the right to seek health care, to seek therapeutic care for yourself? That's in the European laws that are enshrined. Now, I've heard our Constitution cited, Article 38(1), which says that no person should be tried in any criminal charge save in due course of law. How is anything that can be gotten from a therapy session necessary for the due course of law? I haven't heard yet one viable example. And we can ascribe a lot of things to Eamon de Valera, but really, I don't think he was sitting down in 1938 writing Article 38(1), thinking, oh, therapy notes, must have that for the right to a fair trial. So I think that we have to completely challenge the reality, and I've spoken to many representatives in the rape crisis centres, and they say that they do not understand why due course has been interpreted in this way, that there's no credible evidence. And let's be frank, this is only being done as a chance to find something, some nugget, to undermine the credibility of the victim. It's been done for no other reason. The mere possibility of these notes, by the way, being used is deterring people from pursuing cases, from seeking counselling, and is creating huge trauma. So I don't think an amendment will do. We need to outlaw this. We need to get, for example, in the US, there is therapist and client privilege. And we need a similar situation here. People do have the right to seek help. This is just misogyny writ large. So I want to move on to your response to the motion, Minister. Obviously, we're all happy that you're not going to oppose the motion. But I hope you're not just killing it with kindness, because you mentioned in the media coverage that some of these things are being looked after by the government. Leave it in our hands was kind of the impression. But, you know, people have left it in your hands for long enough. But also you mentioned, in particular, I want to talk about the Judicial Council. You said that the Judicial Council is solely responsible for some of these things. No, I do absolutely not accept that the Judicial Council, which is made up solely of judges from the Supreme Court right down, should be left to self-regulate. That's worked so well, you know. The idea that they should decide what they do, how is that a proper system with, you know, input from ordinary people? We need accountability. We need training of judges, training of legal teams about rape myths. It is not compulsory. We put in a PQ about this before. There's no monitoring about how many people do it. And there's no record kept of how many people go. It's just there. It's take it or leave it. What other job would you be allowed to do that, by the way? You know, not, you know, professional development that's absolutely vital to people's lives, that you can just go, pick or choose whether you go or not. Now, you mentioned as well the zero tolerance strategy. There was so much fanfare about zero tolerance a few years ago. Following the horrific, tragic killing of Aisling Murphy, there were so many promises that so much would be done. And we have to say about zero tolerance, there isn't even zero tolerance in political parties about violence against women. So let's be frank here, even in your own party, people have been selected who've carried out violence against women. So other laws that need to be enacted I want to mention as well. So Valerie's Law, I'm sure you're well aware of this, and we also have, oh, apologies, I didn't realise, was that out of my time? Okay, I can take this up after. Can I just mention that we have the brother of Valerie French here today, and it's very important that that's moved on and enacted. Thanks.
I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the statistics, and I think it's important that we read them into the record. And I just want to read the first few sentences of the motion. And they read as follows. The World Health Organization states that gender-based violence is a global pandemic and is the greatest threat to the health of women and girls worldwide. A woman or girl is killed by a partner or family member every 10 minutes. And in this state, since 1996, 274 women have died violently. 52% of women have experienced sexual violence in childhood or adulthood. 35% of women have experienced psychological, physical and/or sexual abuse from an intimate partner. Women's Aid were told of over 40,000 disclosures of abuse in 2023, and the Gardaí responded to over 65,000 domestic abuse incidents in 2024, 1,600 of those in Christmas week. So this is obviously an appalling vista, and it is really worrying and really depressing. And the time for talking has long since gone. We obviously need action immediately. And as Deputy Coppinger has said, the legal and court system is hugely difficult and creates huge difficulties for victims in this situation. It effectively re-traumatises the victims and feeds into a situation where only 5% of sexual violence is reported to Gardaí, and only 14% of the cases make it to trial. So in this situation, we obviously need urgent action and urgent legislation, and particularly legislation to stop the access to counselling records by the accused and their legal teams. We need to end the practice of character references in these gender violence-based cases, and we need to provide advocacy for victims in the court process. And we also need training for judges, Gardaí and juries. I want to refer to the domestic violence services in my own constituency, operated by Coonsair in Clonmel for South Tipperary. It's an organisation I've been associated with since the mid-1990s, and I'm currently a board member and treasurer, and has developed from very small beginnings in the mid-1990s. And through the huge commitment and dedication and professionalism of staff at all levels, has developed into a county-wide service being acknowledged for its excellence. And it provides a range of services to victims, including a helpline, emergency accommodation, support and information, outreach support, court support, childcare, parenting, counselling, training, and together with Tipperary County Council, a safe house. I want to acknowledge the work done by the organisation, and to thank the recently retired project leader, Geraldine Mullane, who has given huge leadership, exceptional leadership and professional service to the organisation over the years, and to wish her well in her retirement. From the annual reports of Coonsair and indeed other similar organisations throughout the country, it's clear that we need additional emergency accommodation. We also need additional safe houses. For instance, Coonsair was unable to admit over 205 women and 230 children in the last 12 months to their emergency accommodation. We also need to ensure that staff are paid properly and that they have enjoyed the same salaries as comparable staff in the HSE, Tusla and Coon. And this is something that needs to be done urgently, because it has the potential and is already creating difficulties in relation to recruitment and retention of staff. I commend the motion. Thank you.
I want to start by commending Deputy Coppinger and her colleagues for using their private members' time to put forward this extremely important motion. As Deputy Coppinger has indicated, the Government will not be opposing this motion. I want to assure her, however, that is not the case of the Government saying leave it in our hands. I'm fully aware that on this issue that Government will not have all the answers. There are many proposals that have been put forward by Deputy Coppinger and her colleagues with which the Government agrees. Some proposals are more challenging, and I'll outline them presently. But this is such a significant and widespread problem, Cathaoirleach, that it is certainly the case that Government on its own won't be able to resolve this issue. The issue of violence against women, and that's predominantly what we're talking about, is of such a pervasive nature that I think we really need a response, not just from the political system, but we need it also from society as a whole. I think one of my functions as Minister for Justice is to try not just to change the law and to change the policy, but also try to give effect to societal changes in attitudes. Predominantly, women are the victims of this violence, and consequently, predominantly, men are the perpetrators of this violence. I think it's incumbent upon me as a man, male Minister for Justice, to try to speak as well to those men who think it is acceptable to perpetrate violence against women. We must repeatedly emphasise it is not acceptable. I agree to a certain extent with what Deputy Coppinger said in terms of what is the origins or the provenance of this violence. A lot of it, like a lot of violence, is about control, trying to control individuals, and for too long some men believe that they are entitled to try to control women. That societal attitude needs to change. I also know that Deputy Coppinger and her colleagues have been working with many survivors and victims of domestic and gender-based violence in order that their voices are heard. I want to welcome those victims and families of victims to the gallery here today. I want to commend them and admire them for their bravery in coming forward, Cathaoirleach, and speaking out as they've done. And I think it's also important to point out that the voice of survivors are particularly loudly heard when they go through the court process and it results in a conviction against the perpetrator of the appalling violence against them. I note what Deputy Coppinger has stated about the challenges posed by the court system. But I have to say that the voices of those who do go through the system, and I know it's very challenging and we need to make it easier, but the voices of those who do go through the court system and who obtain a conviction at the end of it are very loud and very influential. These women remind us that although we've made improvements, reformed our laws and strengthened support structures, we still have much to do in moving along this journey to seek justice. As I said, we won't be opposing this private member's motion. We're not yet where we want to be and where we need to be in a society where zero tolerance in respect of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence is our objective. The statistics in this area are frightening, Cathaoirleach. I think it was Deputy Healy who referred to the CSO statistics in their survey of sexual violence that was published in 2022. It is simply unacceptable that more than half of the women in this country have experienced sexual violence in childhood or adulthood. I'm pleased to say the CSO is now also doing a survey in respect of, and they're doing this along with Kuhn, in respect of domestic violence survey. That's something that we need further information on as well. We can't really adequately respond to this problem or to any problem unless we have the necessary data in respect of it. And I regret to say I have no doubt that the figures will reflect the reality that far too many people are living with domestic violence in this country. But to deal with it, we need to know the data in respect of it. And I just want to turn to the private member's motion, and I'd just like to outline what the government has done and some issues in respect of what's been raised. Deputy Coppinger very much focused on the issue of disclosure of counselling notes. I remember I was a member of Dáil Éireann back in 2017, as was Deputy Coppinger, when we dealt with the Criminal Justice Sexual Offences Bill, which was going through the House then. And Section 33 of that bill was the inclusion of the new Section 19A. And all of us thought at that time that this was a provision that was going to deal with that issue. And if you read Section 19A, as I did earlier today, on paper it looks like it covers all the important issues. It says that disclosure notes shall not be, or counselling notes shall not be disclosed unless it's necessary for a fair trial. But unfortunately, the application of Section 19A is not operating the way that the Oireachtas intended. And I think it's a point that was made by Professor Tom O'Malley in his review of the legislation in this area, where he said people aren't aware of it. But I'm certainly committed to reviewing it, to looking at it, and if it is the case that we need to have legislation to amend it, I will do that and I'll bring forward the legislation. Deputy Coppinger also mentioned Valerie's Law. I've already instructed my department that I want legislation to be brought through amending the Guardianship of Infants Act in order that we can have a situation where we can, or a court can, remove guardianship rights from parents or guardians who kill or seriously harm another parent or guardian of their child. I hope to have a memorandum going to government next month, Deputy, dealing with getting permission from government to proceed with drafting that, and the heads of bill are being prepared in my department as well. In terms of the domestic violence register, that's something that I'm committing to establish. What I think is important is that if somebody is convicted of a serious criminal offence before the courts, the public should be aware of that. We have a situation in this country where we publish lists of tax offenders. We don't publish a list of people who have been convicted of rape or serious sexual assault. The only way we know about that is if a journalist happens to be in court, or if, as many brave victims have done, the victim decides subsequently to go public in respect of it. I think it's unfair to expect every victim to carry that burden and decide, I'm going to waive my anonymity because I want to disclose the identity of the individual here. I think that's too much for them, and I think we need to have a system in place where there is disclosure of information of people who have been convicted of serious offences. And I'm talking about in respect of convictions only there. The Government also recognises the need to build on the legislative and structural reforms already underway to further enhance support for victims of gender-based violence. We've seen sentences increased. We've seen the Criminal Law Sexual Offences and Human Trafficking Act 2024 signed into law last year, which expands a victim's right to legal representation in circumstances. Also, Deputy Coppinger referred to the character reference issue. At present, as the law is, that if you're going to give a character reference, it has to be on oath or an affidavit, and you can be subject to cross-examination. In terms of the woman you mentioned, Sarah, she should be told who was put in as character reference in respect of the person who had been convicted of the offence against her. Character references only arise in terms of the imposition of a sentence. I'll consider it. But I suppose we need to be aware of, are we going to do away with character references across the board and for all offences? Because I think it would be difficult to say we're just going to get rid of character references in respect of persons who are convicted of certain offences, but for other serious offences we would permit them. So it's an area that I think we need to reflect on. But I want you to know as well that there's a lot of reform going on in the family justice area. A central element of this is the establishment of dedicated family courts with specialist judges assigned on a full-time basis. I think it's important that our family law system operates much more effectively. Regrettably, a lot of the violence that we see perpetrated against women is violence that comes from persons with whom they're in a relationship within the family. So the court service is progressing an ambitious 10-year modernisation programme to deliver an operating model that's digitally enabled and designed around the user, and that is something I think that will improve it. You also mentioned, Deputy, the issue about making complaints against the judiciary. Complaints can be made against the judiciary within the Judicial Council framework. There's also a constitutional mechanism and legislation in place for the purpose, the severe purpose of trying to remove a judge from office. Obviously, we have to be careful that we protect the independence of the judiciary. The last thing we want is for decisions of judges to be subject to review by this House or people that this House decides to appoint to some statutory body. We went through a difficult circumstance in terms of establishing the Judicial Council so that it would retain its independence. And it can examine the conduct of a judge in cases where judicial misconduct is alleged. You've also called in your motion for education programmes to challenge misogyny and gender-based violence. There's a substantial body of work already underway with Kuhn at the core of its efforts. And can I just say, educational and awareness-raising campaigns have covered the issues of sexual consent, domestic abuse and intimate image abuse. And building on the momentum of those campaigns, Kuhn is launching a campaign called Hardest Stories, and it's actually been launched today at 11 a.m. And Deputy Coppinger, I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm going to go down and launch that campaign by Kuhn this morning. The launch is at 11 o'clock, so regrettably I'll have to leave here at 20 to 11. But Minister of State Collins will be here for the rest of the debate. I know, but I think it is appropriate that I do go down and launch. I think it is appropriate that I do go down and launch that Hardest Stories campaign by Kuhn. And it's also working in partnership with the Department of Education. So I want to thank you for the motion. The Government isn't opposing it. This is an issue, Lasken Corla, that requires full attention from Government. But as I can just repeat again, Government won't have all the answers. There's a requirement, and I will listen to all suggestions that come from this House. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Deputy Connolly is next.
And thank you to Deputy Coppinger for bringing this and setting it out so clearly in the motion, and to the visitors in the gallery. And I welcome that the Minister is not, and best of luck to you in your new role. And I welcome that you're not opposing the motion, but often that's the death knell. But I'll give you the benefit of the doubt in relation to it, that it's not the death knell, and you will take this matter seriously. And I hear you're committed to bringing in the register and changing the law. And I've only a short time, 5 minutes, I think, so I won't win it. I welcome what you're saying, and I think you have to deliver on that. And I say that in the context of 1974, a groundbreaking book, Scream Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear, 1974 in Chiswick, London, and Chiswick Women's Aid, 50-something years ago, Scream Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear. Fast forward 49 years later, the Royal College of Surgeons, hidden in plain sight, domestic violence and gender-based violence. And so, forgive me if I'm sceptical, because as Deputy Coppinger has said, we've listened to the news this morning with what seems another murder, another woman in her 80s. And so we're here. And since I came in 2016, along with all my colleagues on this side of the House and with some of the backbenchers, we've repeatedly spoken on the failure to deal with domestic violence and gender-based violence. And actually, I'm most uncomfortable with the word domestic. I think it reduces the importance, the seriousness and the significance of criminal activity. So I would like to get rid of the word domestic and treat violence for what it is. I'm also unhappy with the words like epidemic and pandemic. This is not an epidemic. These are serious crimes being committed by the most part by men. And so over the last number of years since 16, we fought and pushed the government. So my worry is there's been no proactive action on behalf of the government. It's all been reactive, pushed from the opposition, and we've been pushed from the organisations on the ground. Women's Aid in particular this week have come out, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But we've been pushed to push the government. And so you did produce a number of reports, finally, before you got the zero strategy. And what you produced was, the TUSLA produced an audit of refuge services, completely inadequate. And then the department did a review of the structures and services there. And what did they say? They said there was an absence of data, an absence of funding, fragmentation, gaps, deficits. That was 21 or 22. So 1974, scream quietly or the neighbours will hear, and fast forward to a report telling us lack of data, lack of funding, deficits and gaps completely. And all of the time the numbers for violence increasing and increasing, and the world becoming a more unsafe place for women and families becoming for. And the figure you referred, Minister, unfortunately, you said unfortunately most of it is within families, and absolutely, it's shocking the figure. 63% of women were killed in their own home. 53% were killed by a partner or ex-partner. And almost 9 out of 10 women know their killer. And so my difficulty when we have debates like this, and I'm really appreciative that Deputy Coppinger has used her time, is we're talking. I've been talking since 2016. I'm very familiar with the services on the ground. Back in 2002, Savvy produced the groundbreaking report, Sexual Assault and Violence in Ireland. We utterly ignored it. The prevalence of violence against women was clearly set out. And then you fast forward to the Royal College of Surgeons that's telling you it's hidden in plain sight. So then we begin to ask ourselves as legislators, what's happening here? What do we mean when we say we want a zero tolerance? And we never rolled out enough refuge. And I say that with caution because Women's Aid, and I'm somebody who has called for more refuge and will continue to do so. But Women's Aid, Safe Ireland has called on the government to embed a full infrastructural response to domestic abuse at local level rather than prioritising new refuge spaces. And the CEO said, we are very, very concerned that there will be a focus on refuge building at the expense of the real response to new refuge spaces. More has to be done, and the government must take seriously. So I'm almost out of time. So I do all of that to emphasise it's beyond talking. So refuges are the most basic thing that we can provide, but they should be sort of redundant in the future if we are to seriously tackle and deal with domestic and gender-based violence.
Thank you, Deputy O'Brien.
Last count, Corla, I'll be supporting this motion today, and I want to thank Deputy Coppinger for using her first opportunity in private members' time to raise this absolutely critical issue. And there can be no equivocation when it comes to assessing our efforts to end violence towards women and girls in this country. We're simply not doing enough. And I say that as a former Minister for Equality, I say it as a politician with a long-standing interest in this area, and I say this simply as a person living in Ireland today. And all of us elected here in Leinster House, we have a responsibility to keep this issue at the forefront of our debates and our legislative and policy efforts. That's not to say significant work hasn't been undertaken. We've seen the third national strategy published, we've seen increased investment and the establishment of CUAN, an agency solely focused on DSGBV. And I'll acknowledge the commitment that former Minister Helen McEntee brought to this area. For my own part, the introduction of 5 days paid domestic violence leave was an important tool to provide assistance to victims. I'm glad that this leave is now in place and that Ireland is one of the first countries in the EU to introduce it. And I want to recognise the work that Women's Aid did in supporting the introduction of that policy. But all of that, it is still not enough. And we know it's not enough as women continue to die violently. 3 women so far this year, according to Women's Aid: Paula Canty, Annie Heineman and Gillian Curran. We're barely 8 weeks into 2025, and information about another death is emerging in the last 24 hours. And we know it's not enough as the most recent figures show that just over 65,000 cases of domestic abuse were recorded by An Garda Síochána last year, a 20% increase over the previous 2 years. So it's a steady rise of 10% per year each year since 2020. And we know it's not enough because we still see that applications for domestic violence protection orders have increased by 25% in the 5 years to last September. And notwithstanding the statistics, it's of course critically important that women and girls who've been victimised can access the support of An Garda Síochána and the court service swiftly and to the fullest extent. This isn't always guaranteed, and today's motion rightly identifies the many barriers and factors that are working against women and girls who deserve timely, appropriate justice. And while all efforts to help victims are of course absolutely crucial, they are by definition addressing the symptoms of the overriding problem. Prevention is the critically important piece if we're ever going to get this right. And this is recognised in the Istanbul Convention, but it's not always prioritised in the state's public policy. Prevention was a major focus. It was something that the Green Party raised continuously in the last government, and that's why in the third national strategy published last year, there's a lot greater focus on prevention than in the predecessor strategies. This broader strategy recognises a hard truth. Violence against women and girls will stay a feature of our society until we successfully address the root causes and until our preventative effort works, and this requires a cultural and a generational shift in attitude. And at the heart of it is a necessary shift in male attitudes towards women and girls, and a shift in the general societal attitudes about the spectrum of violence and abuse directed at women. And we know this is possible, but it is crushingly slow. The state holds the power to drive this kind of cultural shift forward in our educational curricula, through public information and through a zero-tolerance criminal approach. And that's recognised in the motion today, and I welcome that. Minister, I'm glad that this motion will be agreed, but I come back to my earlier point. There's no doubt that all of us in this House share the goal of ending gender-based violence in this country. But, as with anything, genuine progress will take a laser-like focus at the top of government. And as Minister, yourself and the Senior Minister, you are bombarded with competing agendas, but you cannot let this particular issue slip. You need to drive forward change, you need to drive forward progress at an even greater pace. Until women and girls stop being targeted, stop being victimised, stop being killed, we as a country will never have done enough.
Sinn Féin now, Deputy Carthy. You have
Carmaigat Lascan Corlagus Boalum Buicus Gaul Leson Chapta Coppinger as the Aspiract Harcher and Gesh Tabakta Shaw. Mar Coffeemage Jira a her le Ferregan and I Mna August Colini. I want to thank the movers of this motion, and particularly Deputy Coppinger, who has an unimpeachable record on this issue. And I also want to welcome the guests to the public gallery today. Tackling violence against women and girls must be a priority across our society. Every day, women and girls face violence in the form of domestic and sexual abuse, stalking, harassment and intimidation. Figures that were revealed by the Minister for Justice to me last week showed that the number of emergency calls made to Gardaí reporting domestic abuse rose from 44,000 plus in 2020 to over 65,000 last year. Hundreds of women have died violently in Ireland. Many were killed in their own homes. Most were killed by a man known to them. 274 women have died violently in this state since 1996. So as we look at these figures, women will rightly wonder how much has really been achieved in the years since the government's so-called zero-tolerance strategy was announced, because women do not feel safe, and often they are not safe. So we have to do better in terms of preventing domestic and gender-based violence. We have to do better in terms of supporting victims of such violence to getting to safety and to rebuilding their lives. And we have to do better in terms of ensuring that victims of gender-based violence get the justice that they deserve in a timely manner that does not compound their trauma. It's crucial that CUAN, the new statutory government agency that's dedicated to tackling and reducing domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, is provided with the resources needed to do its job, particularly in the areas of prevention. The government also needs to ensure that Garda Síochána and the justice system have the resources and the training to better deal with these issues and these violent attacks. We know that the long delays in our courts prevent survivors from rebuilding their lives. Domestic violence refuge centres, and I hear what our previous speaker have said, but they often represent the only place where those experiencing domestic violence can find safety. There are still far too many places, and there are still counties with no refuge at all, including Cavan and Monaghan. The figures for domestic violence for the Cavan, Monaghan, Louth region, also revealed to me by the Minister last week, reinforce the demand for urgency with regard to opening domestic violence refuges in both Cavan and Monaghan, because these figures show that this region has the highest number of calls outside of the Dublin region. And the reason why that's important, Minister, is because when women present, sometimes they feel that they have nowhere to present other than to their local TD's office, which in itself is a scandal, because we have to deal with people given their most intimate, private details in a setting that isn't appropriate, and they ask directly what's their options. And oftentimes they are left with the conclusion themselves, having dealt with all the statutory agencies, is that the option provided to them is either to make themselves homeless or to return back. So the lack of availability of affordable housing is one of the greatest barriers and challenges for women and children who are victims or survivors of domestic abuse. It also means that women and children are often forced to remain in refuges for longer than is needed, and in some cases, as I say, the option of returning to the abuser is actively considered, and in previous very tragic cases it was what happened. Supporting the long-term housing needs, therefore, of survivors of domestic violence must be given the priority that it deserves. In dealing with the issues of domestic and gender-based violence, it's also important that we listen to the survivors of rape, sexual abuse and domestic violence. We need to listen to them, particularly in terms of their experience of the justice system. Survivors of rape, sexual assault and domestic violence and their families have raised a very important number of very important issues which need to be dealt with by the Oireachtas as a matter of urgency. And I'll be proposing that the incoming Justice Committee, when it's established, actually meets with survivors who have contacted us in advance of today's debate, because there are clearly a number of areas where legislative changes are required, including dealing with the re-traumatising impact of victims, counselling notes being disclosed in rape and sexual assault cases, the blocking of parental and inheritance rights for those who kill their spouses, and the need to create a domestic violence register. It's also clear from the survivors that the disclosure of counselling notes during a trial severely compounds their trauma. The commitment in the programme for government to deal with this has to be fast-tracked, and what I'll say finally, Minister, is if the government are intent on fast-tracking this side of the House, will accommodate them.
Thank you, Deputy Devine.
Thanks, Deputy Coppinger, for the comprehensive motion. Gender violence. It will further the state's response and our society's attitude to this insidious harm in virtually all walks of life. The statistics are startling, as by my colleagues here. Substance abuse, poverty play its part in the domestic and gender-based violence, and disturbingly our homeless figures, they don't include those who are accessing safe havens. We welcome the inclusion of criminal behaviour which was previously not recognised: abusive, coercive control, revenge porn and marital rape. In my role as a mental health nurse, and just talking to women, and why it was always women that was referred to and not the perpetrator, the women, especially older women, say to me, "I didn't know we had rights. I made my bed and I had to lie in it." That's what they were told. We have moved on from that, but we have so much more to do. Zero tolerance policy for these crimes, showing 52% of women and 28% of men reported experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime. This underscores the need for the Coon governmental agency to locate all aspects of tackling domestic and sexual violence. Minister, please consider 1. Local authorities must be supported to provide priority accommodation for victims fleeing life-threatening situations. 2. Introduce an emergency flea fund to set up new lives. 3. Shelters must have access to emergency medical and local GPs. 4. Sinn Féin have submitted to the Civil Legal Aid Review that the €18,000 threshold for legal aid remains far too low. Also, while the Irish courts refer convicted domestic abusers to rehabilitation programmes, there is no obligation on them to complete it. Only 10% did so in 2023. Completion of these schemes should be a condition of sentencing, and we should discuss whether all such convictions should be referred to the rehabilitation programmes and to a Jenny's Law Register. Thank you to the brave women and men in the gallery who spoke out and in doing so call attention to the plight of other victims. I also recognise those voiceless victims who have yet to come forward, who cannot do so for fear of their own safety. We will continue to demand action on your behalf. Gura Mahalgath.
Thank you, Deputy Farrell.
I just first of all want to thank Ruth Coppinger for bringing forward this motion and indeed for campaigning inside and outside of this chamber, as well as all those people who have joined us here today, because it is such an important issue, Minister. Minister, in the last year we've seen reports of domestic violence to Gardaí rise by 8% across the state, but indeed by 11% in Galway, and we've already seen women violently killed into 2025, and I just want to say that my thoughts are with those women and the people that love them. But tracking the real incidents of domestic violence is extremely difficult, because in many cases it's kept secret or managed privately through whisper networks, and it is positive that women are coming forward with their stories and seeking help. But this is a public safety issue, Minister, and women should not be left to burden this on their own. But unfortunately, Minister, we see far too often that women who do need help and who seek support don't find the support that they seek. And last week, Minister, in this chamber, I raised the institutional barriers, specifically around housing, that are placed in front of women by this state who are trying to leave domestic abusive situations. And this week again, Minister, I met with another woman who had exactly that situation, who left an abusive, a very violent situation with her 6 children. She had been living in a council property in another county. She left to go to Galway, where she had family support. And because of the institutional barriers that are placed by this state, she wasn't allowed an inter-county transfer, which meant that she had nowhere to go. She had to start a new housing application with Galway City Council, which means that now she's only days on the list in a county where you need to be 10 years on the list to get a housing situation. This is another barrier placed by this government, and this is something that your government, Minister, can change. And as a result of this, she's now staying with her mother, in her mother's house with her 6 children. It's very overcrowded, and this situation is straining their relationship, which further isolates her and weakens her support network. Galway City Council can't even offer her emergency accommodation because it is full. This woman said to me that she's thinking about returning to the abusive relationship because she has no other option. This is absolutely horrifying, but it is a barrier that is placed by this state in front of women. This needs to be changed, Minister. You have the power to do that, so do it.
Thanks very much, Deputy Farrell. Deputy Ruth O'Reilly.
And I want to welcome the victims and survivors and their families who are in the gallery this morning, and I want to thank Deputy Coppinger and her group for bringing forward this motion and providing us with the opportunity to have this important discussion. Minister, in November last year, Focus Ireland published a report which found that domestic violence is a significant factor in making mothers and their children homeless. I want to illustrate this, if I can, by using just 2 of the many examples that I am dealing with currently in my own office. And Minister, I would take this opportunity to remind you that in my constituency of Dublin Fingal West, we do not as yet have a domestic violence refuge. I'm dealing with a woman, and I'm not going to name her because for reasons of her own health and safety. She was very, very seriously assaulted by her partner in or around 14 years ago. In around 7 years ago. She had been 7 years on the housing list in Dublin City at that stage. When he was sent to prison, She moved as far away as she could get while still remaining in her workplace, and she moved to North County Dublin. She now finds herself in a situation where she is high up on the Dublin City Council homeless list or housing list. She is absolutely terrified she'll be offered a house, because the house that she will be offered will be in the place where her abuser, now released from prison, will be living. Now, I have been from the Gardaí to the council to the DV agency, round and around and around, and I cannot find anybody to deal with this, because the problem when you have the interaction between domestic abuse and the homeless crisis that your government have created is that there needs to be a senior decision maker who can assist. And there are multiple cases, and I spoke to my constituency affairs manager this morning before I came in here, and we are dealing with multiple cases of people who have safety orders or protection orders, but who are forced to live in the same house as their abuser. And Minister, I would like you to just consider what that would be like, going home to your home every single evening because you have no choice and you have nowhere else to go, and you must return to your abuser. Minister, this needs to be tackled, because the interaction between domestic abuse and homelessness is making lives dangerous and intolerable for victims and survivors.
Deputy Donnelly.
Can I thank also Deputy Coppinger for bringing forward this motion. And just to say that from 2020 to 2024, 62 women, north and south, on the island of Ireland have been killed by their abusers. And as a society and a state, we have to do better in terms of tackling gender-based violence. It requires investment in services, including the provision of adequate refuge places in every county, and it means ensuring our laws are fit for purpose, including dealing the new challenges created by social media and technology. In 2024, the Sunnis Domestic Violence Charity in our area, in my area in Dublin 15, helped 631 women and 661 children in the refuge, transitional housing, safe homes and community outreach. However, 368 women were unable to be accommodated in Sunnis in 2024. That is an absolutely shocking number. And what that actually means is that people were unable to get the help and support that they needed to get out of a situation that they're in terms of domestic violence. The number of calls made in the DMR Western region, which again covers the Dublin 15 area, increased in 2023 from 5,458 to 6,025. Women's Aid said at least 1 in 4 women in Ireland are subject to some form of abuse from a current or former partner. Violence against women continues to rise, yet there remains no response from the government to address the issues of the shortage of places and supports for women who are caught up in these circumstances and who are unable to leave. And we deal with these cases on a daily basis, where people are coming to our constituency offices right across, and I'm sure your constituency offices as well, where they are absolutely terrified, afraid for themselves and for their children. So I would urge the Minister, we really need to get a grip on this situation, because the reality of it is that women are dying. Children are being left in traumatic circumstances, and they need help and they need that support now.
Thank you. Deputy Commonwealth.
Minister, the truth is that we do not take this issue seriously. I want to thank Deputy Coppinger for bringing this here today before us again. But I do that with an absolute heavy heart. Because let's face it, if we were serious about tackling violence against women, sexual, financial, coercive control, all of those things, we would be doing something about it, and we're not. And I look at a grant age that I saw there that was granted. It's twice as much as what it was for the scanner in the National Library. We do not take it serious. We do not have the sanctions in the first place. So why do perpetrators do it? They do it because they get away with it, and they're allowed to get away with it over and over again. How many women could be alive today if we took this issue serious. We talk about a zero tolerance. Well, if we had a zero tolerance, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing, and we certainly would have a proper justice situation. We don't have that. We are putting children day after day in very serious, dangerous situations where we're making them spend time with perpetrators. I know people myself where the judges have been making the children go to see the perpetrators, to spend time with them, after they have threatened to kill them. That's our law. These are the laws that are there, by the way, to protect people. We make it impossible for women to leave, not least because of the housing situation, and to bring their children with them. There's just so many things. I am so fed up in talking about it and not doing the things that need to be done around violence against women and domestic violence. I have been working in this area for over 20 years now, and I don't see progress. And I don't see the progress that is needed and that is talked about over and over again. And yes, we need more refuge places, of course we do, but we need to stop people doing it in the first place, and we need to call them out, men and women, to stop them doing it. I want to commend the organisation Beyond Surviving. I met Ciara last weekend in Castlebar. That is a hugely important organisation as well. Why aren't we bringing in Clare's Law and Ginny's Law? Why not? Why don't we have it in? You have the support of the whole House here to be able to do that. If there was a will there to do it, we would be doing it, and we would be doing it as a matter of urgency.
Thank you. Deputy Ward.
Minister, we have to have a zero tolerance approach when it comes to gender-based violence. This issue is compounded by a judicial system, a political system and a society that fails to confront the problem. I've seen at first hand the incredible work that Saoirse's Women's Refuge do in my area. They inform me of the stress that a woman has to go through in the legal system. The process of obtaining a safety order can be difficult logistically and as well as mentally. Often a physically and mentally abused woman will have to bring her already traumatised children into the family law courts. There is no privacy, there is no space, and they often feel unsafe. We need to make these court proceedings more survivor-friendly. More and more women are now having to choose between homelessness and a place that is no longer safe. Apologies. Imagine the trauma of being physically and mentally abused and having the courage to reach out for help, and then left with a Hobson choice of staying in the home with the abuser or going into homelessness with your children. We know that when a woman decides to leave a domestic abuse relationship and a physically violent relationship, that is the most dangerous time. A quick search on Women's Aid website this morning showed that 274 women have died violently in Ireland since 1996. 274. And I hate bringing up stats because behind each one of these stats is a real person, is a real family member. It's somebody that is being failed by the system that's out there. 63% of these women were killed in their own homes. 55% of these women were killed by their partner or an ex-partner, and almost 9 out of 10 of these women knew the person that killed them. In my own area in Dublin Midwest, we've seen a 10.3% increase in the amount of domestic violence incidents in the last year alone. Minister, women deserve better. Women deserve to feel safe in every space that they enter. I do not want to live in a society that treats 50% of its population as less worthy just because of its gender.
Very much, Deputy Ward. Deputy Alan Kelly, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Let's go here, and very best wishes in your roles. First time you've been in the chair when I was here. Right. I want to thank the Independent and Parties Group for tabling this very, very important motion, and also to welcome all the guests that are here in the gallery. I'm going to be sharing time with my colleagues Marie Sherlock, George Lawler and Conor Sheehan. This is a very important debate, Minister, and raises a number of issues that need urgent and ongoing examination. Last July, my party tabled a similar motion addressing many of the same calls following the courage of Natasha O'Brien. In the motion, we specifically called for a review of the practice of suspended sentences and the criteria used for applying these to those convicted of violent crimes, increased urgency in the development of sentencing guidelines by the Judicial Council, clear guidelines on the use of character references, and a comprehensive database of judicial sentences. reforms to the court system to better protect and support victims and survivors of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, including provisions of efficiency training for legal professionals and the judiciary, consistency in sentencing and provision of access to rehabilitation programmes for perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence, the introduction of a commissioner to act as an independent advocate and voice for victims and survivors, a review of the Irish Defence Force regulations in order to deal more proactively with members either accused of or convicted of violent crimes, increased funding from the government for the provision of additional refuge places in line with the Istanbul Convention, and increased resources in budget 2025 for Cuan, and a commitment to multi-annual funding for rape crisis centres and other domestic sexual and gender-based violence service providers. In the 6 months since then, unfortunately little has changed and more shocking cases have emerged. Tackling sexual and gender-based violence in all its forms is a core whole-of-government responsibility, Minister. It needs input and cooperation from departments across government, such as health and education, as well as justice. It requires a coordinated and sustained response from a host of state agencies and government departments. We cannot confine ourselves to believing that by rolling out yet another criminal justice measure in this House, the problem can be solved. It can't. DSGBV is much more than just an issue for law reform, although that may well be needed. And above all, we need more research, evidence and awareness. I think that the motion reflects this when it highlights, for example, the prevalence of rape myths and their impact on the criminal justice system. Myths about rape and about the criminal justice system's attitude to rape may well have an impact on a victim's decision whether to report on the attitudes of Garda Síochána who receive a report, and on the decision whether to prosecute. The English Law Commission published a consultation paper in 2023 on evidence in sexual offence prosecutions. Rape myths and how to tackle them was high on its agenda. The Commission was able to point to local and international research on the issue. We cannot point to similar evidence here because we have not commissioned the necessary research, Minister. The Minister should resource Cuan to carry out that work. Moving to prosecution decisions, the DPP's guidelines for prosecutors states that prosecution should not be instituted unless there is admissible, relevant and credible and reliable evidence. The guidelines also state it is not the practice to operate a rule under which conviction would have to be regarded as more probable than acquittal. But where the likelihood of conviction is low, other factors, including the seriousness of the offence, may come into play in deciding when to prosecute. And there is then listing a string of considerations which, taken together, may well provide reasons why prosecutions are relatively rare. According to paragraph 413, it is important to know if there is independent evidence which supports the complaint. This could be evidence from another witness or forensic evidence such as fingerprints or DNA evidence from body tissue. This makes the case stronger than one based on one person's word against another. There is a question whether this guidance is influenced by societal views and myths, and it merits review, Minister. We need accurate information about the influence of myths in judging complaints in sexual offences cases, whether on the grounds that credibility and reliability are doubted by the prosecutor, or whether the prosecutor is anticipating the way the juries and judges will respond to such factors. An anticipatory approach could create a vicious circle in low conviction rates, produce a feedback effect that influences later police investigations and assessments of the evidence, including the believability of the complainant, and rules out even more prosecutions. Ongoing public education, particularly about consent, remains key, as the motion outlines. What every complainant is entitled to from the legal system is that his procedures will maximise the quality of their evidence in terms of its completeness, coherence and accuracy, and will enable all witnesses to give their best evidence to a fair and unbiased tribunal. This is the minimum they deserve. As Labour outlined in our manifesto just gone, and as we recommended in the Citizens' Assembly report on gender equality, there is a need for a Commissioner to act as an independent advocate and voice for the victims and survivors in the criminal justice system. Victims must be properly informed on how to make complaints about sentencing and ensure that supports are there for them in what is an alien environment for absolutely most of them. A key point is that cases must be heard quickly. The longer a victim has to wait for justice, the more likely it is that a case will re-traumatise them. We strongly support, Minister, the need to implement Valerie's Law and Jenny's Law. I know the Minister for Justice has an ambitious agenda, and I hope he'll take both of these on board and prioritise. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Kelly. Deputy Sherlock.
I want to start by just thanking Deputy Coppinger for the motion and to very much welcome it here today, and to pay tribute to all in the gallery for your campaigning and for your strength, because obviously the experiences that many of you have had comes from the most appalling circumstances. So thank you for all you do to bring to our attention the appalling reality out there. In the Dublin rape crisis and a report from last year, Sarah Benson put it very starkly that statistically it remains the case that the most dangerous place for women is in their own home. The nightmare of violence and abuse most commonly would be the hands of a current or former intimate male partner. And yet, when women finally make that enormous decision to leave, there are so few places to go. Minister, it's 14 years since Ireland signed up to the Istanbul Convention. Back then we were told we needed a refuge place per 10,000 of population. We had 131 refuge places in 2011. In 2024, that number has just barely crawled up to 159 refuge places. It is absolutely despicable. And worse, it doesn't represent any meaningful increase in terms of the number of refugees in this country. We're just about running to stand still because our population has increased by over 805,000 in that period. The programme for government makes promises which we very much welcome, but so did previous governments, and they were unmet. The promises now are also way off what we need, and we can't just go about acknowledging the numbers, the increased numbers of those reporting violence, the increased numbers in barring orders, and not make the provision accordingly. And it is unforgivable in this day and age that we're forcing women who are fleeing with their children to go through an additional trauma of having to travel miles every day for their work and school. And I think of the woman in Cabra who had to go to Coolock, and then when she timed out of the refuge in Coolock, had to go to Step Aside and was travelling for an hour and a half every single day with her child to get him to school, and then walk around the streets of Dublin because she couldn't get back to the refuge to then be back to collect her child in the afternoon. That is unforgivable. So to the counties that don't have a refuge, that is a huge issue, but in Dublin we also have a massive shortage. The other critical issue that I want to raise today as well is the specialist training for Gardaí responding to those 999 calls. And my question to you, Minister, is every single member of An Garda Síochána given specialist training? And if they are given training, is that training trauma-informed based on victims' experience? Because my understanding is that it's not the case. There's no specialist training for trainees, for probationers, and for those answering those 999 calls in our community.
Thank you. Deputy Lawler.
Thank you, Last Concorda. I'm pleased to support this motion. I want to thank Deputy Coppinger for bringing it forward, and I'd like to welcome also our guests in the public gallery. I want to speak also about the importance of women having access to refuge places. And as a member of the Voluntary Board of Management and the Director of Wexford Women's Refuge, I have seen at first hand the benefit of having a refuge in your locality. The benefits of having skilled, compassionate refuge staff available to guide victims through the difficulties and advise them on some of the obstacles and issues highlighted in this motion. For 5 years I chaired the building subgroup of Wexford Women's Refuge, and last year we opened a new state-of-the-art building in the heart of Wexford town, which saw the refuge triple in its capacity. Wexford Women's Refuge also offers outreach services, meeting women in a safe place of their choosing. It offers court accompaniment, access to counselling, working closely with Wexford's Rape Crisis Centre and also agencies like Barnardo's, Youth New Ross and the HSE, to name a few of the great services available to the vulnerable women and their children. An in-house child and family support worker is just one of the highly skilled staff available within the refuge. Despite all of this, staff at the refuge are put to the pin of their collar and often find it impossible to keep up with the workload and demands on the service. And yet, County Wexford can consider itself lucky to be in a position to actually have a refuge. Sadly, 9 counties in this country have no domestic violence refuge accommodation. Cavan, Carlow, Laois, Leitrim, Longford, Monaghan, Offaly, Roscommon and Sligo are devoid of refuge accommodation. Wexford gets multiple requests from outside the county for accommodation and are almost constantly operating at capacity, despite last year's tripling of their accommodation. So can you imagine the feeling of isolation the women in these counties feel in the knowledge that within their communities and their locality there is no safe haven of a refuge? As this motion states, only 5% of those who experience sexual violence as an adult reported it to Gardaí, and of these it is estimated that just 14% make it to trial. The victims and survivors of sexual violence have spoken about their harrowing experience of the legal system. And ludicrously, the accused has the ability to request access to counselling records of complainants. We must put an end to this absolutely invasive and traumatic allowance to perpetrators. And we must support the call from the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality in 2021 for the exclusion of counselling and medical records from evidence. It's the very least we can do to support the victims of this heinous crime.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Sheehan.
Thank you very much. Last Count Corla, I would like to thank Deputy Coppinger and her group for bringing forward this important motion, and to welcome the survivors who are in the gallery up above, who, should not need to come here in order to see this issue addressed. And I would like to pay tribute in particular to Natasha O'Brien, my own constituent, for all her advocacy in relation to this work. I rise here and I'm very conscious of the fact that as a man, we are the problem, as we are the perpetrators of this violence. And I'm very clear that as a man and as a white man in a position of enormous privilege, that I do want to be a positive role model and an agent for change. And this is an issue that permeates across society. And the fight against this scourge cannot be led by women and women's rights movements alone. This is a global human rights issue. As the author Margaret Atwood said, women are afraid that men will kill them, and men are afraid that women will laugh at them. And as Mary Cassidy, the former state pathologist, said, and it goes very clear to the root of this motion, it's the man in your bed and not the man under the bed that you should be worried about. And this motion contains a number of practical measures, many of which were contained within a motion that we brought forward last year, and we're very happy to support it. Items like ending the practice of victims' counselling notes being accessed and read by the accused during trials, ending character references in cases of gender-based violence. And we also need compulsory training of judiciary to give a better understanding of the harm of rape myths, and this is all contained within the motion, because domestic and gender-based violence in Limerick hit a 10-year high last year with over 2,500 reports. And we have had instances in the past where members and former members of this House have given character references to people for individuals convicted of gender-based violence and sexual crimes, and that is something that should bring shame on all of us. Thank you.
Very much, Deputy. Commons.
Garv Margaret, Last Count Corlan, Cavorticus on your new post. While I'm wake as I go, like Deputy Coppinger, Oslan Tirshkin Shaw. When I went to write this speech, I found the words very hard to come, and not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid once I started to speak that I wouldn't be able to stop, and that I would get so annoyed that it would be beyond what was allowable in this chamber. Listening to the testimonies from people around this country, I can't help but be furious and frightened. A long time ago, in the late 90s, I worked in a domestic violence project service in London, and it was for Irish women, and I was struck then, as a very young person straight out of college, how many services there was there for women from all over the world. And I'm afraid that the situation has not improved from the late 90s. However, this is not about me. I'm a public representative here to voice my opinion, not my opinion, the voices for other people who have been subjected to gender-based violence. This affects everybody of all ages, classes, colours, creed and job. And actually one group contacted me, I'm sure they've contacted other people, to say that in this chamber, of the 174 of us, 59 of us have perhaps been subjected to sexual violence. And I'm sure TDs in this House have received many emails urging people to support this motion. We're living in a time where women are being murdered. 6 so far this year. It's the 26th of February. And indeed, last night we read in the newspaper that there's another woman has been killed on a ferry. Calls to Women's Aid and other domestic violence services are at an all-time high. The Rape Crisis Centre is inundated for support. It's out of control. Deputy Coppinger's motion brings forward many things that we need to address. And one of the things that I find most galling is the fact that, and lots of people have mentioned it today, is that when you have experienced gender-based violence and then you go for counselling to help yourself, that can be used against you. Now, the Minister said earlier that it was set out that it was to prevent an unfair trial. But who's the unfair trial for? Do you know what I mean? Like, who is it pitched against? So, from the lens of education, however, violence in the home is detrimental to learning and the long-term education retention. In 2015, it was found that 40% of cases referred to Women's Aid, there was children who had experienced and lived with domestic violence, but they also experience, physical and sexual abuse. In 2023, there was 4,478 incidents of child abuse disclosed to Women's Aid. And in Europe, the findings that I read was that 73% of women who experience physical or sexual violence by a current or previous partner indicate that their children had become aware of that violence. How can a child or a young person who's living in a home where there's violence, control, abuse, learn? How can they focus on the homework, study for an exam? How can they do their college assignment? The short answer is they cannot. Their trauma, their adverse childhood experience envelops them, and they go into survival mode. To learn, one needs to be able to relax, be comfortable, have a structure in the session they're doing, and this is very hard when they're shouting, screaming, crying, violence and fear. And then there's young people who are in intimate relationships. If they're in a learning environment, how are they supposed to do their college work, their further education work? 51% of young women affected said that they had been abused under the age of 18. 1 in 5 young women in Ireland have been subjected to intimate relationship abuse. So how can these young women who are in college or starting out their careers, how can they be at the level that they need to be at? They can't. They can't achieve what they would like to do. It's not acceptable. We need to act now, and I'm very happy that the government are going to not object to this motion. And thank you very much,
Thanks,
Deputy Coppinger.
Deputy Gannon.
Good morning, and thank you to Deputy Coppinger for bringing forward the motion. I want to begin by acknowledging the guests we have in the chamber today, and my party leader, Holly Kearns, has also been in touch to acknowledge the presence of Mr David French in the gallery, who I know she has been working alongside to create a bill to bring forward a Valerie's Law, and we'll continue to push that as heavily as we possibly can from opposition, though it would be infinitely more easier if it actually came from government. Count Corla has become absolutely routine to be confronted with new reports highlighting the devastating impacts of gender-based violence in Ireland. Time and time again, research published across our media details new lows the country is sunk to when it comes to the prevalence of the crisis. But it feels like as a society we're becoming increasingly more desensitised to its magnitude. It's been said before, and it'll be said, since 1996, 274 women have died violently in the Republic of Ireland. In 2024, there was an average of 1,250 incidents of domestic violence reported to the Gardaí every single week. These statistics alone demand an immediate response from the government, yet time and time again they are reduced to a headline. While it's positive that women are coming forward in recent years, the data that we do have on the issue comes from an under-resourced frontline agencies filling the gap where a state should be. The epidemic of men's violence against women continues to be framed as a women's issue across all facets of society. Last Count Corla, we know gender-based violence is one that must be confronted by men ourselves. We've created a society where there's such a pervasive sense of male violence against women that that the phrase has been coined, femicide, to describe the epidemic. Even the very term allows men to evade accountability for this ongoing crisis. It was over close to 15 years ago now. I remember reading an article by Tom Maher, whose wife Jill was brutally murdered in Australia, which he phrased as the monster myth. This myth that allowed us to see men's violence against women as perpetrated by an othering of monsters that allowed ourselves to escape and not cast blame upon the culture in which that is created. Asking Carla, I'm quite fearful in the culture in which we've now moved into, where these same perpetrators of men's violence against women are no longer seen to be hiding in dark corners or being uttered. They're actually the President of the United States. They're the sports stars with contracts and sponsorship deals. They're men with large social media platforms who are actively targeting our young male children in schools as a way of kind of increasing their toxicity, normalise their toxicity and their violent hatred towards women. It's something that needs to be confronted on a macro level in terms of education programmes, positive interventions, creating role models, and a society that removes and helps us remove that culture that has been targeted every single day at our children. Alongside this, we witness a clear and alarming rise in violence among men. That's globally and locally. We are at risk of a society where women will bear the brunt of men's violence even more than they already do, and we will be confronted with even more horrifying statistics. This is not just a crisis, it's a clear warning sign and an opportunity for the government to act. The use of therapy session notes and legal proceedings of sexual assault cases is nothing short of cruel. It's horrendous that such a scenario is still allowed within our court system. We've heard time and time again that this process re-traumatises survivors, leaving them with no real safe space to heal from an unimaginable trauma. The absolute antithesis of restorative justice is the re-traumatising of our victims. And that is exactly what our court system is allowing with this system. And it is incumbent upon us to intervene and provide legislation which that no longer can be allowed. This motion calls on the government to acknowledge the gender violence epidemic and take immediate action to overhaul the justice system. And the Istanbul Convention, which Ireland signed up to, demands at the very least prevention, protection, prosecution and coordinated policies to protect women against men's violence. I absolutely support these measures and at the most basic starting point addressing the issue of men's violence against women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Gibney.
And thank you to Deputy Coppinger for using your private member's time to introduce this really important motion and the opportunity to discuss it. And I welcome also that the Government isn't going to oppose the motion, although I do share the same scepticism and concerns that have been aired by other colleagues that we really need to see action on this issue, because this is a scourge in our society, a scourge of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. The reality is that all of us know somebody who is either experiencing or has experienced gender-based violence, whether or not we know that. And I commend the motion because it does speak to all four pillars of the Istanbul Convention: the prevention, protection, prosecution of domestic gender-based violence and the coordinated policies that we need to mitigate it. And I welcome as well that there is a focus on the justice system, because although we have seen improvements in recent years and we have seen the establishment of CUN, which obviously does need the resources, I would say, to match its remit, it is simply the reality that the justice system continues to re-traumatise victims, and the areas where it specifically does so is in the areas of, for example, character references, the release of counselling notes and so on. So it is so important that we address the justice system and address the re-traumatisation of victims and survivors of domestic violence, and instead create a pathway for them to access justice which is welcoming and which assists them and supports them the whole way through. From my interaction of working with and talking to those people who are on the front line of dealing with domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, they describe for me the fragility of the process, that it takes women to come forward. And when we see these really problematic features of our justice system, you can see how that fragility is just shattered. Because why is it that you would come forward when you know you're going to be faced with this and when you know that prosecutions are so problematic? And of course, that fragility is exacerbated by things beyond the justice system as well. And I would call out particularly the accommodation space, where we're in, for example, the Housing for All programme. We didn't see any mention of this topic, where we know that there are not refuges in enough counties to even meet the Istanbul Convention parameters, and that we need to make sure that these spaces are available so that when women come forward, that they are met with an actual response that can support them. And for my remaining time, I'd like to focus in on two words within this motion: challenge misogyny. Because it is the reality that it is our patriarchal society in which we live that tolerates that misogyny. And it perplexes me that we don't, as policymakers and as legislators, connect enough the misogyny that we see that underlies this domestic, sexual and gender-based violence with the everyday sexism that women experience and with the gender order that we simply tolerate in our society. It is the case that women are paid less, that we take on more of the care work in society, that unpaid and underpaid, that we have poorer outcomes when it comes to employment, and that we experience, as half of the population, everyday sexism in our day-to-day lives. I'm in this stall 3 months, and I have been called a girl multiple times by colleagues around me. And that is not okay. We see on the cabinet benches a dearth of women, and on the government benches an underrepresentation of women. All of this, to me, says that we are still a sexist society, and we need to connect on that spectrum, the sexism that we experience with the misogyny that underpins this. I agree with the Minister for Justice that this is not just a legislative issue, it is a broader societal issue, and we need to speak to that. But there is plenty that we can do as legislators, and I would like to emphasise the need for greater legislation in the online space. I researched pornography and violent pornography and the impact it has on young children about 10 years ago, and at the time there was tools being touted around age verification and so on. We have done nothing. And immediately when we talk about pornography, people put forward the argument of free speech, that pornography has been around for ages. But we did not in those times have what we have now, which is the ubiquity of pornography and the message that it is sending to young men and women about how to behave in a sexual environment. Our young men are being exploited and groomed by figures on the online space who are having a hugely problematic impact on them. And we need to address this, and these are areas that we can address as legislators. Finally, I would like to commend those people who do work in this space, who I believe take on a role that actually the state should be offering, and I'm talking about those NGOs who support women in coming forward and in rebuilding their lives. And I would finally like to thank our guests in the gallery today for coming and being a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Paul Lawless.
Minister, the crisis in gender-based violence continues to devastate our society. Domestic violence cases are up 20,000 cases in just the last 4 years alone, and women and children are and do bear the brunt of this crisis, Minister. This crisis is happening in every constituency across the country, including Mayo, where the highest number of domestic abuse cases have happened in over a decade. The COVID-19 pandemic, where the government's message of stay at home, it caused a major difficulty for so many victims of domestic violence. Our homes, for most of us, Minister, are the places of solitude, of protection, and so on. But during this time in particular, this really became such a difficult scenario where essentially victims were trapped and locked in their homes with abusers. The case of Natasha O'Brien was really a shocking situation. And, you know, we shouldn't need to rely on victims and brave victims, as Natasha was, to seek the justice they deserve. We do need tougher sentencing. And I believe her case really outlines the fact of the very lenient sentencing that exists in relation to domestic violence. Minister, I also want to raise an important issue around the release of prisoners. It is really unacceptable where the victims of domestic abuse only learn of the release of their perpetrator when they meet them in their communities, when they meet them in the shop, in their clubs, etc. And I think we owe it to the victims to give them the respect that they deserve and give them the information in advance that their perpetrator is going to be released. Minister, I also want to raise the important issue of hardcore pornography. There's absolutely no doubt that the hardcore explicit pornography is blurring and distorting the lines and boundaries of sex and violence in relation to it. We do know that there is major issues with young people in particular accessing hardcore pornography, and it does distort relationships between men and women, the image of women as objects, of being sexually violated is very, very concerning. And we have raised this a number of times. We have a bill that would actually ban hardcore pornography to young children, and that is something, Minister, we need action on and no longer delaying. You've said in the past that it can't be done. It can be done, it should be done, and it needs to be done, Minister. And the case of Anna Kriegel, the poor 14-year-old girl who lost her life, hardcore pornography was a huge factor in relation to that case with regards to her attackers. So, Minister, we want to see action on this. The Aintu bill would ban hardcore pornography to minors in this country. I also want to commend the great work of the Women's Refuge across this country. In my own constituency in Mayo, for example, there's great work happening in the Mayo Refuge, but they are under-resourced, and we do need to ensure that victims who are brave enough to seek out for help receive the help that they get, and there is major difficulties around capacity in Women's Refuge across the country. So I would appreciate it if you could consider this seriously, and we do need reform in this.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. And Lascan Corla, can I congratulate you on your new position? And I welcome your remarks earlier in the House where you promised to work in a non-partisan way and in a fair way. And I've always known you to be a gentleman of that character throughout your tenure here in the House and in your private life also. Could I also welcome the many people that are in the audience today or in the gallery today who have experience, who have emailed us as elected members of this House and have shared their difficult experiences and enlightened us in this House. Last Corla, I rise to speak about domestic violence that remains totally unrecognised in the housing problem. Women stay in refuge. We've already heard that there's 9 refuge centres missing in counties. In the entire North Cork region, Mallow over to Fermoy, we have no refuge centre. That needs to be addressed. We need to be coming up and exceeding the Istanbul Convention. But also what I want to bring up here in this House is that how women are unrecognised by the housing authorities and local authorities, women who have been victims of domestic violence. Quite often women who are victims of domestic violence have nowhere to go or no alternative. Some of them having to return to the home where they have been violated, where their children have been abused, where they've been told that they'll be murdered, where they've been told that they'll be attacked. And yet local authorities are looking for more and more information of them to say, you're not on an emergency list, you're not on a priority list. If you're here at this desk looking for social housing, you're not on any priority list. And then they're coming up with questions straight out saying, but you already own a home. So quite often you're involved in, your name is down as a homeowner, so they won't accept them on lists. And people are going off continuously, having to get more and more information to provide and prove to a local authority that they are victims of domestic violence, that they are victims and that they are entitled to be on a social housing list, to even qualify for the HAP payment, to get out of the oppressor's way, to be able to secure a roof over their heads for their children. And that's not acceptable. And also, it's been mentioned in this House about the training for Gardaí, but what about the training for local authority staff? From city councils to county councils, in housing bodies all over the country. What are they doing? Is there staff training provided on a national guideline how to deal with somebody who's in a situation of domestic abuse, who comes to the counter? Because very, very often people come to the counter and they're dismissed, saying, you're not on the list, we're not interested in you, we can't talk to you. And that has to be addressed, Minister. We have to have training for our local authorities, and there has to be, equally, as there is a disabled list or as there is a list for people with medical needs in city councils and county councils, there has to be those that are victims of domestic violence to be put on a priority list to be housed to secure them and their families. Thank you.
Thanks,
Lascan Corla, and again congratulations on your new appointment, and to the Minister, best of luck in his position also. For people from domestic violence, and I welcome the people in the gallery today, the services like Adapt House in Limerick isn't enough. If you're in the rural part of Limerick, you have to go into the city to get refuge.
So you're taking people out where they may have supports locally, where we need more houses like that within the areas to help people that are in that situation. I have a big issue with media, because if you look at social media at the moment and you look across all the different cultures that are shown on social media, that it shows that it's acceptable in some cultures that men can hit women. And it's been shown on social media, even here in Ireland. So we also have to send out a clear message. This is not acceptable for the Irish people or any other nationality that's here. It's not acceptable. And we need to send that clear message out. We watched the Olympics recently, and this is where the government also need to stand up, where we have people that are identifying as a woman. And I have no problem of a person identifying as a woman. I don't. Because I respect you, I see two genders, but I respect whatever you are. That's fine. But when I see a person that's identifying as a woman and goes into a boxing ring and boxes a woman, and that globally is accepted, I have a problem with that. A huge problem with that. But the government here needs to send out a clear message to everyone that it is not acceptable for violence against women. It is not acceptable for violence against men. It is not acceptable for violence against children. We have to make sure that the message comes clear and strong from government that it's not acceptable in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Gorgley.
Thanks, congratulations. Violence against women is a global problem. It happens in so-called capitalist societies, it happens in socialist societies, it happens in religious communities, and it happens in secular communities. It happens across the world. It may have an increasing risk in areas of deprivation and poverty, but it's not related to income or social status either. We have our own background of patriarchy and misogynistic history. But even in modern Ireland today, the levels of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence in Ireland is totally unacceptable. We've by no means lived up to our commitments under the Istanbul Convention. The facts are stark. 1 in 4 women in Ireland have been abused by a partner or former partner. 5% of women who experience sexual assault report to the Gardaí, were only 14% making it to trial. The legal system, as we know and others have spoken about, is harrowing. In 2023, there were almost 29,000 contacts with Women's Aid. Domestic abuse motive was recorded for 90% of women in relation to victims of murder, manslaughter and infanticide. Women are more likely to be injured as a result of violence and need medical attention. And since 1996, over 270 women have died violently in the Republic of Ireland. We are by no means a shining example in any case. And we did have legislation such as the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act 2017 and the Domestic Violence Act 2018 to aid the protection of victims of domestic violence. But still, there were 25,570 applications to the District Court for gender-based violence against women in 2023 versus 23,536 in 2022. There's an increase of 10% every year in terms of domestic abuse cases brought before the District Court. It's abhorrent. Now, we know we've increased sentencing for domestic violence from 5 to 10 years, passed by the Minister for Justice. Way more needs to be done. There need to be consequences to end the practice of character references before sentencing for those convicted in cases of gender-based violence, to protect the confidentiality right to privacy and therapeutic healthcare for victims, advocacy to be provided and representation for complainants in the courts process, to end rape myths within the courtroom, to invest and recruit court personnel so that nobody must wait more than a year for sexual assault, rape or gender-based violence cases, educational programmes in schools to challenge misogyny and gender violence, mechanisms to make accountable and even recall judges who make misogynistic and insensitive rulings, make accommodation for women and children who have been abused a priority, because housing and accommodation in refuges are a major issue in our country. Introduce Valerie's law, as previously referenced, to remove guardianship rights for those who kill the other parents of children. Femicide and intimate partner violence training for Gardaí. To introduce Jenny's law, domestic violence register, to make available information about anyone with a conviction for domestic violence. And I note the Minister for Justice on the 11th of February talking to myself referred to a scheme of the programme for government in relation to domestic violence, but it didn't include a domestic violence register. There's no mention of this legislation, only to work with Gardaí, and we need to actually have some legal mechanism to, and bring in Jenny's law. In the minute I have left, I just want to talk about the wider societal issue. where influencers on YouTube, on TikTok, all across social media, and even on absolutely mundane and absolutely mind-numbing programmes like Love Island, it's seen as acceptable for men to commit misogynistic acts against women, for women to forgive all kinds of abuses and bad treatment, and for that to be seen as the norm on our national TV. It is not the norm. These people are making money online, perpetuating the myth that somehow men have been hard done by women, that somehow by ensuring that women have their rightful rights, that men are being hard pressed. It's not the case. But we need to work both in society as well in the educational system to make sure that this pervasive influence is dealt with. And we have to deal with the algorithms in social media as well. Gurv Mogget.
Much Deputy. Minister Michael Collins.
Thanks, Chair and Deputies. I'd like to thank People Before Profit Solidarity for tabling this motion on gender-based violence, and I want to take the opportunity also to acknowledge the emphatic contributions made by all speakers right across the House. And like other speakers, I also want to acknowledge our visitors here in the gallery today and to thank them for their input. As Minister O'Callaghan made clear earlier, the Government is not opposing this motion. We are all in agreement that we need to keep the momentum of change going as we work towards our objective of zero tolerance for domestic, sexual and gender-based violence in Irish society. The programme for Government commits to tackling this epidemic as a major priority. As Minister for International Law, Law Reform and Youth Justice, I now have a key role in supporting Minister O'Callaghan and Government colleagues to keep driving improvements in the criminal justice system and to supporting victims of gender-based violence. I'm deeply committed to this work, this important work. The third National Strategy of Domestic, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence was published in 2022 and runs to the end of 2026. Under this zero tolerance strategy, we have increased funding for supporting victims, introduced new legislative provisions and established COON as a dedicated agency to further drive this work. Minister O'Callaghan mentioned some of the reforms that have been introduced to better support victims of gender-based violence, including increasing the maximum sentence for assault causing harm. In addition, we now have a new standalone offences of stalking and non-fatal strangulation. Both of these offences are common ways in which abusers target victims. It has been shown that non-fatal strangulation can be an indication of future lethal violence and is a risk factor for homicides against women in the home. Other legislative reforms have extended restrictions on perpetrators cross-examining victims and provided for preliminary trial hearings. The introduction of pre-trial hearings has helped to increase efficiency in how trials are run and allow for difficult issues to be dealt with in advance. This reduces delays and eases what can be a traumatic process for victims. The Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Human Trafficking Act of 2024 addressed a number of the recommendations set out in the comprehensive O'Malley Review of Protections for Vulnerable Witnesses in the Investigation and Prosecution of Sexual Offences, including around anonymity and legal representation in certain contexts. It also introduced a provision in relation to character references in sexual offence cases. Now, regardless of whether a reference is being provided in person or in writing, this must be done on oath or via an affidavit. This requirement underlines the gravity of providing a character reference for a convicted sex offender, and it goes further than the regime in place for other serious crimes such as robbery or manslaughter. A number of deputies have raised the issue of the disclosure of counselling records. This is a complex and highly sensitive area, balancing individuals' rights. On one hand, there is the victim's right to personal privacy, and on the other, the accused person's right to a fair trial. This entails a right to disclosure of any material that may strengthen the defendant's case or weaken that of the prosecution. And if it is breached, the prosecution may be compromised or the conviction quashed. The law in this area was substantially reformed in 2017 by the insertion of a new Section 19A into the Criminal Evidence Act of 1992, which created a new process by which the court would examine applications to release counselling notes and make a decision taking into account the right of the victim to privacy and the risk of traumatisation, while ensuring that the constitutional right of the accused to a fair trial. However, it appears that this provision is not operated in practice as intended. So, given the importance of the issue, the third National Strategy on Domestic, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence committed to examining and reviewing the issues again, including from the victim and the survivor perspective. To progress this important work, an interdepartmental working group led by the Department of Health was established in 2024 and includes stakeholders from the sexual violence NGO sector who ensure collaborative input from vital victim and survivor services is taken into account. Officials in my department are examining, as a matter of urgency, what steps, including adjustments to the legislation concerned, could be taken to ensure the appropriate balance between the rights of the victim to privacy and to seek counselling help, and the right of the defendant to a fair trial can be achieved in practice. Any changes to the law must be carefully considered to avoid the risk of constitutional challenge. Another focus of today's motion has been the removal of guardianship rights for those who kill the other parent of their children. This is a commitment in the programme for government as part of the ongoing work to implement the appropriate recommendations from the study on filimicide and domestic and family violence death reviews. This work is progressing on an appropriate legislative amendment, and it is a priority for Minister O'Callaghan. A central element to delivering the zero tolerance goal of the third national strategy was the establishment of the statutory domestic, sexual and gender-based violence agency, COON, which was launched 1 year ago this week. COON has a specific mandate to drive the implementation of the cross-government, bringing the expertise and focus required to tackle this complex social issue. It works in collaboration with the NGO and domestic, sexual and gender-based violence services sectors to ensure that the best possible services are in place to meet the needs of victims and survivors, including safe and accessible accommodation. And I know some deputies mentioned in relation to refuge spaces. There was 12 new refuge spaces delivered in 2024. In 2025, this year, COON expects 22 new units to be delivered in Dublin and Louth, with a further 49 units due to be under construction or due for refurbishment in 2025. And that will bring the total amount of new units to be delivered and under construction to 230 by the end of 2025, which brings that number from a standing point of 140 at the outset of the strategy. Deputies mentioned the need for education programmes to tackle domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. COON is leading on the awareness-raising campaigns designed to reduce the incidence of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence in Irish society, as well as ensuring that all victims know how to access the supports they require. COON is also working in partnership with the Department of Education on the new SPHE curriculum across junior and senior cycle in secondary schools, and oversees the highly successful Consent Ed project in partnership with Galway Rape Crisis Centre, which provides training for secondary school teachers. In addition, in an age-appropriate way, the resources cover healthy relationships, boundaries, consent and challenge misogyny and gender-based violence. In addition, the Higher Education Authority and COON are co-funding the development of a new sexual violence awareness campaign, which will be rolled out across 12 higher education institutes in early 2026. A number of other key actions have been delivered under the 5-year zero tolerance strategy. Divisional protective service units have been rolled out so that specially trained Gardaí are available to support victims of sexual offences across the country. In addition, a new sexual offences unit has been established in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. My department is funding a professional diploma in intermediary studies at the University of Limerick. A pilot scheme has been put in place in the criminal courts nationwide, and a register of qualified intermediaries is available to the DPP and the court. A review of the effectiveness of the pilot scheme will inform further improvement and rollout of the intermediary system.
Again, I want to thank deputies for their wholehearted and emphatic contributions here today. I ask you to keep the spotlight on gender-based violence active. There has been important progress made, but we must work even harder collectively to improve the system and further enhance supports for victims of gender-based violence. Reform takes time, but my department and government colleagues are fully committed to making it work better for those who need it, for those who are the victims of these horrific crimes, who must be at the centre of everything we do to reform this process.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Yeah. Can I thank Deputy Coppinger for putting forward this motion as well, and can I pay tribute, as others have, to those in the public gallery for coming here today and for having the courage to speak up and to advocate and to campaign on this issue. And your presence is hugely important, because if you listen to the government and if you listen to the contributions here, you might think that there is a very clear determination to address the scourge of gender-based violence. But the facts that have been outlined in the motion and repeated by some of our contributors here suggest we are a very, very long way, and the government is a very, very long way from taking the actions necessary to address this shameful, horrendous, frightening situation. And that's what these figures are. The fact that more than half of women have suffered sexual violence, either as a child or as adults, is absolutely shocking. That more than a third of them have suffered that violence at the hands of a partner is absolutely horrendous and frightening. The fact that 1 in 4 LGBT people have suffered abuse and violence, and that 72% of LGBT people suffer verbal abuse is horrendous. The Natasha O'Brien case, I mean, to me, just in one case, summed it all up, that a 24-year-old woman walking down the street who intervenes on behalf of somebody who is being subjected to homophobic abuse, then herself gets violently assaulted in public by somebody who does it in a way where they think it's acceptable, and then has to fight for some kind of justice in terms of the response to the state to that horrendous situation. And I hear others referring to other cultures and so on, and you often hear that about and rightly so in some cases, about the treatment of women. But these statistics are some of the worst in Europe and testify to the failure of successive governments and our society to deal with an absolutely toxic, poisonous, dangerous, criminal violence against women, LGBT people, and people based on their gender. It is absolutely horrendous. And the state doesn't exactly send out a good signal in terms of the way we deal with people who have been victims of that violence, has been referred to by others. I heard the Minister sort of boasting about the 12 additional refuge places, a pitiful number last year, 12 extra, against a background where we are not even close to meeting the Istanbul targets. I suspect those 12 could be in Dunleary Rathdown, my area, which is one of the counties that hasn't had refuge space at all up until very, very recently, and where Istanbul would require, just in that county, 48 places. There was a recommendation for 24, but what we've actually got is 12. And of course, they are oversubscribed, massively oversubscribed. There's no prioritisation for women suffering domestic violence when they have to leave their home and find themselves homeless. And I've even had cases of women who went into a refuge and were then evicted from the refuge after a number of months and put into emergency accommodation. If that's the sort of signal the state sends out about how much it cares about the victims of this violence, it hardly sends a good signal about the seriousness of the state to deal with it. I just want to deal briefly with the issue of the notes on the counselling sessions. And just one observation on top of the other ones. If we do not do something about this, and we look at the low levels of people taking cases, are these two things not connected? A tiny number of victims of gender-based violence actually go to the state in order to seek justice. It's precisely because of things like that. Why would you, if the notes that could be used in counselling and therapy could then be handed over to the victim and made public? It's an active disincentive to seek justice or indeed to seek the therapy you need after the traumatising experience of being a victim of such violence.
So, Minister, I don't think it sent a very good signal that you actually care about this issue when one member of the entire government sat through this debate is actually an insult. Obviously, there's a few people who have come in now for leaders' questions. I want to run through some of the things that you raised. So, in relation to the counselling notes, the Minister said earlier that there was no issues raised in the debate at the time. Not true. There was issues raised by several TDs at the time, including by myself, where I proposed an amendment and I said we need to ensure that this is operating as intended and not leading to the disclosure of counselling records becoming the norm. It's become the norm. The Rape Crisis Network has confirmed that. So just want to correct the record on that. I'll be bringing forward a bill on this issue. I have yet to be convinced that there's any credible evidence that's taken from a person's private therapy session. It's third-party information in any case. And the Minister actually defended it in the original speech in 2017. So the government talks about trauma-informed, survivor-centred, but nothing in our court system and legal system is that. And yes, you can have different rules for gender-based violence. Why couldn't you? Absolutely no problem with that. It's a very different type of crime to shoplifting or to whatever else. So it's not a big deal to have different rules. I want to say in relation to Jenny's law, I agree that also should be enacted. I want to put that on the record and get time to say it originally. One of the advantages of that will be to bring shame on the crime of domestic violence. That's the key reason. I want to also mention the DPP. Didn't have time to deal with it. The Director of Public Prosecutions is choosing not to, is vetoing the right of people to have their day in court. We saw that with Nikita Hunt, who bravely, I want to commend her, bravely took on a multimillionaire celebrity with a massive social media profile. The injuries, for example, in that situation, and the DPP wouldn't take the case. There's serious questions to answer there. Let people take their day and have their day in court. I also want to mention the scale of misogynistic attitudes in society. The situation with Gisèle Pellicot in France, I think, says it all. It was every man, men of all occupations, that abused and raped Gisèle Pellicot in the knowledge that she had been drugged. This is becoming an increasing problem. And I would say to the survivors and the family members of the victims who are gathered here today who've campaigned, I want to thank you, and I want to ask you to continue on, if you can, if you possibly can, on this struggle, because every time that any change has happened in this country, be it on anything, but especially in relation to the rights of women or minorities, it's been because of pressure from outside this stall. It has never come from within. We saw that with repeal, we saw it with marriage equality, and we see it in relation to violence against women. We will have to campaign to hold this government to account and to make sure that they actually act on this motion. So International Women's Day is our next focal point. On March the 8th, there will be marches in Dublin, 1 o'clock, Limerick, Cork, and hopefully in other towns and cities as well. And so many of the survivors who've put themselves on the line here and who've gone through so much trauma, re-traumatised in our legal system, have committed to support those marches. And I would appeal to trade unions, women's organisations, community groups, everybody to turn out on those marches that are called by Rosa, an organisation, socialist feminist movement that I'm a founder member of. and that has led the way outside of the Dáil in bringing this issue centre stage. We need to say ni una menos. That's the cry throughout Latin America against violence against women. Not one less. Not one less woman, not one more woman should be lost to violence against women and to gender-based violence. We need massive turnouts on International Women's Day, because it's very clear the complacency that we saw here today in the debate, with the Minister leaving for a press-up and then somebody else deputising for him, and not one of the other members of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or the independents who are always looking for speaking time could be bothered to be here.
Thank you. Time is